There are no perfect people out there, and we all have our weaknesses or vulnerabilities, the way we respond under stress that may not always be helpful. And armed with that information, we can be tremendously more effective in the workplace, as well as, I would argue, happier.
You're listening to the Profit by Design podcast, episode 17. You work hard in your business. On the Profit by Design podcast, we ask the big question: what has your business done for you lately? Hi, I'm Dr. Sabrina Starling, the business psychologist, the author of How to Hire the Best, and your co-host on the Profit by Design podcast. Weekly, my co-host, Mike Bruno, and I bring you tips, tools, and strategies from our own experiences and from the experiences of our guests, who are entrepreneurial thought leaders and real-life entrepreneurs, all to support you in making intentionally profitable and sustainable business decisions to live the lifestyle you desire. Today's episode of the Profit by Design podcast is brought to you by Tap the Potential, the home of How to Hire the Best and the 4-week vacation program, Contractor Business Solutions, and the Small Business Consulting Group. Hey, Profit Designers. In just a few moments, you're going to get to listen in on a conversation between myself and Dr. Christine Allen. I have known Chris probably longer than several years now. I want to say probably 8 or 9 years. And she and I are both certified People Map trainers. And that's how I got to know her. She is a delight. What a fun person to hang out with. And she and I have a lot of interest in helping leaders and team members working from strengths. But that's not what today's episode is about. Today's episode is about how to use psychological assessments in the hiring process and how to use them effectively. So let me give you a little bit of her professional bio. Dr. Christine Allen is a workplace psychologist and executive coach. She's been providing executive coaching, team building, talent selection, and assessment, and other training to senior leaders since 2009. With 20 years previous experience as a clinical psychologist, Dr. Allen is an excellent listener who quickly grasps the underlying issues with which individuals and teams struggle. She helps leaders and teams identify needs, discover, and use strengths. She excels at improving communication within teams, and she specializes in helping leaders develop leadership agility and executive presence. As a licensed psychologist, she is particularly skilled in using assessments for hiring and selection. Her home base is in Syracuse, New York. So she is a board certified coach. She's a distinguished fellow of the New York State Psychological Association. She is past president of the New York State Psychological Association, Division of Organization, Consulting, and Work Psychology. And she's co-chair of the Leadership Institute for the New York State Psychological Association. In addition, she's an official member of the Forbes Coaches Council. So we are in good hands today to be talking about the use of psychological assessments in the hiring process. Let's dive in. Okay, Chris, I'm so excited to have you here. We're going to be talking all about the psychology of hiring and how personality testing can be a really good tool in the hiring process if it's used correctly. And you being an expert in this area, I think we absolutely have the best person here on the show to guide us through the proper use of personality testing when it comes to hiring. And as you know, on the Profit by Design podcast, so many of our listeners are small business owners trying to really wear all the hats in the business and build a team. And so there's not a dedicated HR person or team. They're having to do a lot of this on their own. And so many of them are aware of the importance of hiring A players and quality people. And really, because of my work, How to Hire the Best, so many of them are tuned into hiring the right person and the personality strengths to do the job really well. And that naturally leads into personality testing, but there are some pitfalls that can come up in that process. So that's what I would really like to get into today with you about what are the best practices and what are some things we should know? But before we go there, I thought I would give you the chance to share a little bit about your background and how you came to be working in this area and what you love most about what you do.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I love conversation and I love really helping people be their best selves and find the right places to use their natural talents and gifts in this world, because we all work better together when people are using those strengths. So thank you for the opportunity.
Absolutely. Yes. So tell us a little bit about how you came to be doing this work.
Okay. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, had a pretty traditional career for about 10 to 15 years, and then became frustrated with being pigeonholed, feeling like that even though it's very, very important to help people who have some troubles to have a better life, that all of us could be better every day, and that psychological science has so much to offer everyone in their personal lives and the workplace in terms of becoming their best selves. So I really got interested in the coaching field, but I really wanted to apply my background and expertise in psychology, particularly in assessment. I did a lot of work in my graduate program in the area of assessment, and wanted to really think about how we could use assessments both in the hiring process, but also in the development process of developing leaders and developing teams, so that we are, using our own personalities kind of like a finely tuned musical instrument, that we have our unique kind of instrument, our unique voice, and we will be more effective if we can use our talents and our strengths and be mindful about our own weaknesses and vulnerabilities that we all have. So that's what I started doing. I didn't start out doing hiring assessments. I started out doing work with teams and training in terms of developing people. And then several different organizations asked me, gosh, we really, really love some of the work that you're doing, some of the tools that you've used with us. Could you help us with hiring? And I thought, well, absolutely. Those are things psychologists do. And so it's not the only thing I do or even the thing that necessarily I love the best, but it's such a valuable thing for organizations that I wanted to be able to do it. And it's often an entree where you help someone hire someone, and then you can also help them develop their own skills to really work from the inside out in terms of becoming their best selves and working better together with others who might have a totally different personality or style than you do. So is that helpful?
Absolutely. And I think I should also let our listeners know you and I met each other and got to know each other through the People Map. Years ago, we're both certified People Map trainers. And so I really resonate with, I've never heard that analogy before of the finely tuned instrument and what that's like when you work from your strengths. But I think that's a beautiful analogy. And I really resonate with that. One of the things that you said really caught my attention, and that is the value of assessment in the hiring process. And I want to dig into that a little bit and let's take it from the perspective of traditional hiring practices where we're not using assessments and what that actually can cost us long term. So talk to me about how much it costs us if we have turnover from our hiring.
There are different sets of statistics that I've seen, but even the most conservative ones say that it costs about 2 to 5 times the person's salary for a bad hire, to replace that person. And you think about all of the investment in recruiting and, evaluating a candidate and then hiring someone, training that person, as well as when somebody leaves or gets fired, then you have all of the other work that might not get done. You have other people on the team that might feel burdened or put upon. It affects their productivity. And there are other kinds of costs as well, because sometimes a failed hire or someone who doesn't work out has a negative impact on the organization in terms of reputation. They've let some customers down, or they've done something that's even harmed that brand. So that's where the 2 to 5 times comes in, because I think situations are different. But if you have somebody who's $40,000 annual salary, that could be, between $80,000 to $200,000 to replace a bad hire.
That just makes my heart sink to think about that, because so many of our small business owners are struggling to be profitable as it is, and payroll is the biggest expense. So people are the biggest variable in a business. We can fix our costs and we can put systems in place, but if we don't get our people right, like, our profit just goes out the window. And you also shared with me a statistic: 80% of employee turnover is caused by bad hires, according to the Harvard Business Review. 80% by bad hiring. So that says to me, if we can get our hiring process better and better, we're reducing that turnover, and then we're not going to have those costs, the 2 to 5 times the employee's salary when they leave.
That's right. I would just say that 80%, that study and other studies suggest that the vast majority of that 80% is not a lack of technical skill or competence, which of course you have to have. You can't be hired to be in accounting if you don't have the technical skills, or you can't be hired to be in sales if you have no background. But it's really the behavioral and the personality attributes, the attitude, those things, those kind of softer skills, harder to evaluate, that really are the biggest factor in that turnover.
Well, and that's where I want to go next, because you also shared with me that the leading cause of failure for executives and leaders is poor cultural fit in the organization, and personality problems like selfishness and narcissism, which makes someone a poor team player and more likely to be exploitative. Boy, howdy, if I have not heard that from a lot of business owners, that they hired someone, they put a lot of faith in them, they were in a leadership role, they looked really good, they acted really good, but they were exploiting the business, or they were acting from selfish means and manipulating. So talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, I would say that again, and I know this is something that you do and that you work really hard on, is that whole hiring process so that you get it right all the way through. But that being said, obviously unstructured interviews are tremendously unreliable, like 10% in terms of predictive validity in terms of hiring. But even just the structured interview, really, maybe people can fool people in impression management in an hour or an hour and a half, or even a couple of days interview. We can put on our best selves. We can, our best sort of suit, if you will, and present well in those short periods. So I think that you often don't see some of those more disappointing, disheartening, and, even horrifying, behaviors until someone's already been there for quite a while.
Well, and let's talk a little bit about this, because if you're hiring for a leadership role, there's a certain type of personality that is drawn to a leadership role that can be very destructive in the business. And that's that personality with narcissistic traits. And narcissism as a full-blown personality disorder is present in a very small percentage of the population, but a much larger percentage of the population has traits.
That's right.
So these are the people who want to be in a leadership role in the business. They actively seek it out, but they can be very detrimental. So what are some things that you've seen narcissists do in an organization?
I think a lot of times they can be very focused on their own ego, on their own status, on winning at any cost, at taking credit for things, which makes them not really great team players, enhances those kind of silos in organizations where they're not really looking for the overall result for the organization or for the team, but really about, how they come out. So again, like an analogy would be like a sports team, at some fundamental level in a football game, it doesn't matter if the quarterback makes the all-star team. If the team loses every Friday night and, the scoreboard reflects that they're not doing well, that their overall record is poor. And yet those narcissists, that's what they are looking for a lot of times, is what's in their own best interest. And there are obviously more extreme cases where those kinds of people, there's also a little bit, and I won't get too into the psychology, which is that triad of kind of the dark side behaviors, that psychopathic behavior that they'll even cheat or steal or, commit more fraudulent behavior. So it can even go in that direction. And if we look at the history, things like Enron and other kinds of recent, kind of debacles in the corporate world, Wells Fargo, where people, had poor, supervision, management, and they were encouraged to be to win at any cost. And I know that wasn't all of the individuals who participated in that, but those people who were in leadership who encouraged that kind of culture. So it's so important to be able to, and how hard it is to fire people, to let people go, to get rid of people once they're there. It's so much easier if you can find ways to prevent, keep from hiring them, weed them out at the get-go. It's so much better, for the organization, bottom line, and the culture of, happiness and well-being and productivity for the employees.
Yeah. And that just leads us right into why we would want to incorporate assessments in the hiring process, because you and I, being psychologists, I think we can speak to something that will really let our business owners off the hook for some guilt that they feel. And that is, both you and I are trained to assess personality. And I know I've had people that I've done psychological evaluations on who've sat across from me and they looked very well put together. And I thought, why are they being referred to me? I have no idea why. I mean, they seem like a normal person. They seem like everything is okay. But then we do some assessment and the assessments come back and reveal, wow, there's some narcissistic traits here.
That's
you don't
right.
pick that in a conversation or even a series of conversations sometimes. So for those business owners who are listening to this and you're realizing, wow, I think I've had some narcissists on my team in the past. How did I let them slip through the cracks? Rest assured, Chris and I have been fooled by narcissists ourselves.
That's right.
They're very subtle in their tactics. So we need some, and we're not just talking about narcissists. We really are talking about assessment as a whole,
right,
for picking the right people, but definitely for keeping the bad people off the team. What is the percentage? How much more effective does it make our hiring process when we incorporate good psychological assessment?
What I have read and understood is that, again, there's no magic bullet. There's no silver bullet or complete 100%, of course, but that if you add, to the whole process of the recruiting process, not only to the structured interviews on top of all of the other kinds of, strategies that you would use to get a good pool of applicants to begin with and have good reference checks, it adds about 40% to your odds of hiring, which is almost half, increases almost by half, your chances of a good hire. And I think that's pretty significant. One of the things that, one of the tools that I use, not the only one, but it's one of the big 5 assessments of personality. And the founder for that, he likes to say that, that if you're evaluating someone just on certain either leadership competencies or technical competencies, but you're not looking at what he calls the personality infrastructure, does the person have the personality infrastructure is what's most stable over time. So it might mean that I could hold people accountable, let's say, if I practice at it a lot. But, what's the likelihood, especially if that's a key part of my job, that that's going to be sort of a natural preference or come easily to me? How much infrastructure do I have in my personality to support that particular competency? And if I don't have it, doesn't mean I can't do it, but it means it's going to drain my energy and I'm going to maybe need either more supports or be with a complementary person who can really do the piece that's harder for me. So it's that kind of valuable information that you're going to get from a personality assessment that isn't available, I don't think, in any other way. As you're saying, someone can sit across from even a psychologist and fool you.
Yeah. And so you're not talking about assessment as just a tool in the screening process for hiring. You're talking about now you have information that you can use to develop this person throughout their life with your organization. So it becomes a leadership development tool.
Yep. And that's the added value, is that even if done right, an individual assessment, personality assessment, talent selection assessment, pre-hiring assessment might not be inexpensive. It is the value add that that person, always, I would recommend, gets their results, gets that feedback, and has some kind of at least a feedback session and potentially a little bit more onboarding coaching or developmental coaching, but not, so that they can take that information and say, okay, here's what I need to understand about myself in order to be successful. Here's what could bring me down. Here's what could get in my way. And even though most of us, thank heavens, are not narcissists, there are no perfect people out there, and we all have our weaknesses or vulnerabilities, the way we respond under stress that may not always be helpful. And armed with that information, we can be tremendously more effective in the workplace, as well as, I would argue, happier and, more productive and successful.
Absolutely. I know that we are happier when we get to work from our strengths, and what we have to do day in and day out is so aligned with what we enjoy and what we excel at doing. So let's dig in here a little bit and talk about the right way, the most effective way to use assessments in the hiring process and even post-hire. And then what are some common mistakes that business owners are making and where they may actually be creating legal vulnerability for themselves.
Right.
But real quick, before we go there, let's take a quick break and hear about our sponsors. Hey, profit designers, are you planning your profit in 2019? If so, I want to share a special opportunity with you. In 2019, I'm going to be coaching 5 small business owners through life-changing business transformations. So what does that mean? Well, for starters, we're going to be working on tripling your profit. That means you keep more of what you make and you reap the rewards of your entrepreneurial hard work. Now, you being a profit designer, you have heard Mike and I talking about the importance of designing your business to be sustainably profitable. That's the first thing that we're working on in this program in 2019 with these 5 small business owners. Then we're working on zeroing in on your business sweet spot. This is where we focus on identifying your top clients, what they need most from you, how that aligns with your strengths, and then putting the systems in place in the business to support that. When you have a clear sweet spot, it is fun to run your business. And we often hear a lot of our clients telling us they're falling back in love with their business again. And finally, we will be putting team systems and key performance indicators in place so that you can take a 4-week vacation while your business grows. So if this sounds like what you want to accomplish for yourself in 2019, and you want to be one of these 5 business owners, I encourage you to get your application in. Apply at profitgift.com. That's profitgift.com, all one word, and we'll link to that in the show notes. When we receive your application, it will be reviewed by our team. If you qualify, then we will be in contact with you shortly to set up a meeting with our success team lead who will walk you through a profit audit of your business. And what we're looking for is to make sure that your business really has the profit potential so that the services we provide you will help you triple your profit in 2019. So if this sounds good to you, get your application in at profitgift.com. Visit our website at profitbydesignpodcast.com to learn more about our sponsors and to catch previous episodes of the podcast. And by the way, while you're there, be sure to check out the conversation between Mike and I that 95% of entrepreneurs never have. we blow up the dirtiest little secret in the entrepreneurial world. Okay, we're back. So Chris, let's really dig into the right way that we business owners can use psychological assessments in the hiring process.
Again, one of the advantages of a psychologist, consultant, or coach is that they are likely to have a broad array of tools that are available to them because they're qualified to use a wide variety of tools, so they can choose the right tool for the right purpose. And even a cognitive assessment is sometimes used. This is not an IQ test, but a cognitive assessment is sometimes used at those really high levels of leadership, but you have to do it the right way. Otherwise, you can get sued in a heartbeat, especially for those kind of assessments. So using someone who says, this is our go-to tool, this is all we use, I think has limitations because even if it is a correct tool, and we'll talk in a minute about why some personality tools are and some aren't, but they're limited to usually a range of one or two tools because most consultants have to be certified in everything. So I think psychologists who can do this have a little bit broader bandwidth in terms of choices and might understand which tool to pull out. I personally like to use a few tools that kind of look at both emotional intelligence and personality. And personality and emotional intelligence have been found to kind of overlap. They're similar concepts, but they're also distinct. So it's useful to have tools that look at both of those. And then maybe if it's a leadership role, also some leadership competencies, and there are a number of them. And then you look for, what hangs together here? What can we discern that has, kind of shows up this pattern? And just a real quick example, in a hospital setting, I was doing this assessment with two candidates. The candidate that all the staff loved, everyone wanted to hire. All of the interview data was so much more positive for this man than for this woman because he was incredibly charismatic. What happened in the assessment process, and it also showed up in some of his behavior towards the assessment process, like he didn't finish them on time. And so I had to keep emailing him for that. And then he was in the dentist chair and he forgot. And, but what showed up in these different assessments, the emotional intelligence, the personality assessment, and the leadership assessment, was this impulsivity, this tendency to be distracted, to be scattered, and someone who also might be a loose cannon who could go off on his own tangent, the own way. The only person who had been skeptical about this man was the CEO, who was a very skeptical person by nature. And he just thought, I don't feel like something's right here. I think it would have been disastrous for this hospital to have hired this person. And instead, they hired the person who might not have been quite as flashy. And she has continued to do a wonderful job for them. And she had the competencies and the personality, to really do the job well.
Let me break that down a little bit, because a lot of times I will have business owners tell me, Sabrina, I've got this team member and I don't know what to do. And that's usually how the call starts out.
Right.
And it is that they had a gut feeling about something in the interview process. They could not put their finger on it, couldn't articulate it. And so what you're describing is the CEO had that gut feeling and almost discounted it because the CEO is skeptical by nature. And the assessments picked it up, but it wasn't just one assessment that picked it up. It sounded like at least 3 assessments that you described where there were indicators across those 3. And that, I think, is really the value of using multiple assessments.
That's right.
Because I remember back in my day when I would do personality evaluations, I never wanted to make any kind of diagnosis or sweeping conclusion about someone based on one assessment. But when you have 3 assessments plus a behavioral observation from the psychologist backing it up, then now you're on more solid footing to say, you know what, this candidate, no, we don't want this person because of these things.
The CEO didn't. I think it's also he might have been discounted because he's a skeptical guy. And also I think he didn't want to override, the collective wisdom of his staff. So he didn't trust his own instinct. But you're right. When there was all of that data and the corroborating data of how he interacted with me. When he came in for his interview, which had to be postponed because he had been delayed in filling out the assessments, he never even said, I'm so sorry about your time. Speaking of narcissism, he never said, I apologize that this has inconvenienced you. Nothing. So I think there's just a lot of robustness, I guess, to this, what this process adds, to the traditional hiring and interviewing process.
Well, right. And absolutely. And it's really easy for us to just say, well, he must have been having an off day, so he didn't acknowledge that he was late. But then that's taken out of context. When you have the context and you see there's a pattern going on, that's where the red flags come up. So let's talk about what kinds of assessments we should be using pre-hire and post-hire.
That's a great question. And so, there are assessments that meet certain kind of the testing standards and that are considered compliant with the EEOC. And so those kinds of assessments are the kind of assessments that you want to use. In a general kind of way, they are what we call normative assessments versus this other term that most people haven't heard of, which is called ipsative. And ipsative is more typically a forced choice rather than a continuum. We know that we're not all, one way or another. And so forced choice tests typically put us a little bit more in one category or another. And mostly normative tests kind of put us on a range. We're on this openness to new experience or wanting to do things the same way. Would I fall or would you fall, Sabrina? So that's one difference of these tests. The other piece about that is an ipsative test looks at how I compare to myself. So for example, am I more open? Am I more people-oriented? Am I more task-oriented? Am I more, kind of open, unguarded person, or I'm a more closed person? But it doesn't really compare me to other people. Am I more open or closed than you? If you answer these questions. So when you take a normative assessment, it will look at how does this person compare to the average person or the professional population or people in this industry, most salespeople, accountants or chief risk officers. You can often, some of these tools really have some data that you can rely on to say that this person, their responses are vastly different from that typical managerial population. And then you have to have a psychologist or someone expert to sort of interpret what that means.
Right. And so these assessments also show you if someone has more or less of a particular trait than the general population, which, for an accountant, if you see more lack of follow through than the general population, that's not a good sign for an accountant that you're hiring, right?
Right. And the most common distinction, which always kind of gets a laugh when I'm doing some kind of a presentation, is that, in sales, being optimistic is incredibly important because you've got to be a little bit like the Energizer Bunny and be pretty resilient and not no is just well, there's always a possibility that someone will say yes. So optimism is an incredibly positive trait for salespeople, to be high on optimism. If you are high on optimism as an air traffic controller who says, I am sure things are going to be fine here and we don't need to have to worry about this. Obviously, you want to be detail oriented too. But, being overly optimistic is not a good characteristic for someone in that industry.
No. So we want to make sure that all of our air traffic controllers have had a thorough personality assessment.
That's right,
Chris?
You want them to be thinking about what could go wrong. Now, pessimists are thinking about what might go wrong. What might I be missing? Whereas an optimist is thinking, well, things are going to turn out okay. So that's an important but silly kind of example, but it makes a really clear how personality makes a difference.
No, that is spot on. What a great example. You were going to say something else?
So some of the assessments that people are most familiar with, like the Myers-Briggs, the DISC, the People Map, True Colors, or some of those quadrant model assessments, I believe they really are useful, helping us to have good conversations with each other about different styles and preferences and how you like to be related to, how I like to be related to. but they're kind of a broad brush of personality. They are not normative. They are not EEOC compliant, and they're not wise, or smart for you to use. And really, it's really inappropriate to use them for hiring and selection. You want to be using a tool that you can dig in and get that reliability and predictive validity data on job performance and that are compliant with the EEOC. And that's usually not too hard to find out. And if you can't find it out, then that's a bad sign. It's a sign that's not a good assessment.
That right there is so critical. So if you are listening and you're using an assessment and it's not one that Chris or I have thrown out here, and you're wondering, well, is this one that I can use pre-hire as a screening tool? One of the best things to do is to go online and research, is there any reliability and validity data on it? If that does not pop up right away in your search results, that's an indicator it could be problematic, that it's not EEOC compliant.
That's right. That's a really good way to put it. And then in terms of pre-hire and post-hire, these are all normal personality assessments. So there's not anyone looking in any of these assessments. And I do talk to, even with really bigger companies, some, chief human resource officers or CEOs who feel like, oh, this is a little weird to be giving these personality assessments to people. Are they going to be okay with this? And, I have to say that these are all normal personality assessments. They are not looking at diagnosis or pathology or anything like that. Now, that being said, and there's some different ones out there that look at this differently, but even let's say on that continuum, if I come out, say, just smack dab in the middle of a trait like optimism, pessimism, that might say something important about who I am and how I might be in a particular job role. If someone's at the 99th percentile or the 95th percentile in optimism, that's very unusual. Or someone who's down at the 2 to 3% in terms of introversion, extroversion, that is extremely, most people, might be somewhere between, you think of the bell curves. Most people are going to be somewhere between 30 and 90%. So even though it's not looking for diagnosis or pathology, if someone is more at that extreme end, that suggests a rigidity to their personality or character that could be problematic in the workplace. So you want someone, it's okay to be who we are. We're not going to change our stripes or our spots, but we want to be flexible. And someone who's really out there at the ends is likely to have some difficulty being more flexible and using other parts of their personality or maybe working well together with others.
Got it. So not rigid and being able to flex and adapt with their style. So Chris, I imagine we have listeners who are really curious what assessments are normative assessments and are EEOC compliant and should be used pre-hire. Can you give us some tools and assessments that meet those criteria?
Yes. And again, there are so many out there now that there are many, many that I won't mention here off the top. And even though I don't have to be certified as a PhD psychologist in all of them, I could be qualified. When I use an assessment, I really want to understand it inside and out. I don't want to just scratch the surface. So there are many tools out there that I might not mention that are very good tools to use, but I would prefer to know the ones that I use the most in a very conscientious and reliable way, thorough way. So all the big 5 assessments, the big 5 of personality is the paradigm, is the model. This is called the 5-factor model. And it really looks at introversion, extroversion on a continuum. It looks at how open we are to new experience. And it's not that it's good or bad to be one way or the other. It looks at emotional stability. And you might think that it's better to be resilient than be reactive. But one of the things we know about the people who are a little bit more at that reactive end of the spectrum, they're the ones who are the canaries in the coal mines who are going to say, we've got a problem. We've got to fix this. Those ones way down there at the resilient are the ones who are like, oh, it's not a problem. And so they can be very out of touch. So you can't think about these things as just good or bad. And so the big 5, any assessment that really relies on the big 5, and I just listed 2 or 3 of the big 5, but there are different ones out there for the big 5. And the ones that I like the best and that's very, very popular now is called the Hogan assessment. The Hogan has additional, first of all, they're always doing research to constantly improve and develop and support their consultants and to make their products better. And the second thing is they have the second part of the Hogan, which they talk about looking at the bright side of personality, how we like to show up, what our potential is, how we show up every day, and what they call the Hogan Challenge, which is sort of the dark side of personality, which sounds ominous, but it really just means that under stress, we are likely to have some of our, Achilles heels, to use people map language. We have some of the shadow side, to use Myers-Briggs language, kind of show up in ways that can undermine us. And the most important thing is that we become aware of that and we learn how to manage that. So Hogan Workplace Big Five, which is a tool by Paradigm Personality Labs. And then there are a number of other Big Five assessments. There are several very good emotional intelligence assessments that are EEOC compliant. I tend to use the Emotional Quotient Inventory, EQI 2.0, more than I use others, but there are others out there that are also. Daniel Goleman has a tool. I think it's called the ESCI, but I can't think off the top of my head what that stands for. And then I usually will use some kind of, especially if it's a leadership role, a leadership competency assessment. There's a really, really good book in leadership is Coos and Posner, the Leadership Challenge, and they have the Leadership Practices Inventory that looks at, how well someone is going to develop a vision, inspire the way, hold people accountable. But the CPI 260 is the coaching report for leaders, and it will look at kind of how your personality loads and how you answer in terms of various leadership competencies, like inspiring the vision, like holding people accountable, like self-awareness, like being good at managing relationships. So those are my go-to tools. The other thing I'll say is that I think a values assessment, and Hogan has a values assessment, so does Workplace Big Five, the Paradigm Personality Labs people. Because when you look at values, and then there are a number of open source values assessments as well that are good, you want to make sure that values are about what we want. And so if a culture I have a doctor's office that's incredibly family oriented. They're pictures of their dogs in Halloween costumes, and then they're pictures of the dogs in holiday costumes on the walls, and they're fun and family oriented. That's a very different medical office than office that's very kind of structured and people don't socialize together after work. So you really need to look at someone's values. What is they want out of work to make sure they're going to be happy in that workplace and that they're really a good fit for the culture. Because if someone came into that culture and they never wanted to go to dinner or hang out at this guy's pool or house, they probably wouldn't feel a part of things and they might not be as effective in that workplace.
Wow. So, Chris, you have really sold me that, we're going to use psychological assessments on all of our hires going forward. So what would a business owner who really gets the bigger picture here and is starting to appreciate all that these assessment tools have to offer to help us make better hiring choices, how would they go forward in finding someone who would do this for them, and what can they expect in that process?
Yeah. That's a great question. I hope that anyone who would do this work would do some kind of initial consultation or conversation, that would be complimentary and really help explore what they're looking for, what they need, what kind of person or people they're trying to hire, and spend some time with them, helping them figure that out, and then recommend some kind of a proposal for them. Here's what I'd recommend, and here's why, in language that they could understand. I think one way to find people is certainly to go to any of those, like Hogan has a list of consultants who are both independent consultants, which I would, as an independent consultant, strongly recommend that you couldn't hire somebody from a bigger company company, or hire a bigger company. You can do that. But you can check out the independent consultants like in your area. Ideally, I think I have done some interviewing because you always pair, I forgot to say this, you always pair these assessments with a structured interview done by the consulting psychologist or consultant. Yes, the corporation or the business has to do its own interviews, but you want to do an interview. And I referenced that with the person that was, didn't show up on time, but you always want to do that. So you can do those interviews by Zoom or by Skype. It is better to do the interviews in person, in my opinion. I think it's easier to make sure you're not somehow missing something important when you do that. So if you're looking for someone in your area, you could go for the Workplace Big Five. You can Google the Workplace Big Five. I think, Sabrina, you're going to provide some references or some things people might be able to follow up on from this conversation.
Absolutely. Yes, we have show notes.
Yeah, but you could certainly go to Paradigm Personality Labs has consultants who are certified in the Workplace Big Five around the country and around the world. So you can find someone local to you if that's important to you.
Awesome. Okay. And so this is probably not something that you would undertake for an entry level position if you're, a team of 5. But if you're hiring a leader in your business, this is where it becomes so valuable because, you're talking about working with a trained psychologist and providing multiple assessments. There will be some expense involved. But then, Chris, as you and I were talking about the other side, the cost of mishiring and how detrimental and costly that can be, this really offsets that process and saves a lot of pain and heartache.
Yeah, I was just thinking about those numbers. If I thought about it, if I said even like the low end, if we were talking about a $40,000 job, which maybe if it's a leader or a manager, it could be potentially more than that. And, so an average, a hiring assessment, you're going to get, is going to cost you like almost, 15 to 20 times more for a bad hire than it would cost you for doing this kind of hiring assessment.
Okay. All right. Well, and I know that you have a newsletter that you have offered if our readers would like to follow you. Can you speak a little bit about what you talk about in your newsletter?
Yes. Yeah, my newsletter comes out only about once a month. Sometimes I will highlight other articles that I particularly feel like are very interesting, relevant, timely, important, share some information. And sometimes it will feature an article that I wrote. I'm a contributor on Forbes on leadership. And I write both about how to work together better with others on your team and also how to be an effective leader. And including in that sometimes is about how not only to develop ourselves, but, how to make sure that you're hiring people that will be a good fit for your team. So those are the kinds of things that would be in there. Also usually a list of my upcoming presentations and engagements, some of which are, for a particular group or company, and sometimes that they're open. So.
Okay, fantastic. I know so many of our listeners are interested in those topics, so they will want to get their hands on your newsletter. What's the best way for them to go about doing that?
Well, they certainly could email me, and my marketing website person would add them to my list. And they could also go to the website, and after a few seconds, 20 seconds or 30 seconds, it will pop up and you could sign up for the newsletter that way. But if you email me, I'm certainly happy to make sure that you get signed up for it.
Okay. And what is your email address?
It is Chris, CHRIS, at Insight, INSIGHT, businessworks, altogether.com.
Okay. And your website address is?
It's www.insightbusinessworksaltogether.com.
Okay.
And there's a lot of good information, like in terms of some of these articles that I've participated in or, written on hiring assessments on the website.
Oh, fantastic. That's going to be a great resource for us. Thank you so much, Chris, for being here with us today. You've shed light on questions that I get asked all the time from business owners in the hiring process. So it's very valuable information. I appreciate you making the time to be here.
Thank you so much for having me and asking me. It's been a pleasure and a privilege.
Yes, it's wonderful to reconnect too, Chris.
Okay, yep, that too.
Thanks. Bye.
Here, bye-bye.
Thank you for spending time with us today. Join our conversation in the Profit by Design podcast Facebook group. Share your thoughts on today's episode, ask us questions, and let us know what you want to hear about next. Visit our website at profitbydesignpodcast.com to access resources from our sponsors and tools we've created for you. Subscribe to the show on whatever platform you're listening to right now. There's a subscribe button right there. Go ahead and hit it so that you always get a notification when we release a new episode. And finally, share our podcast with a friend if you know a friend who would enjoy it. Thanks again for listening. This is real life business. Keep your chin up, keep moving forward. You got this.